Welcome to Creamer Media's Polity. I'm Brad Doubleman. I'm in Pretoria at the Institute for Security Studies to meet with Jackie Cilliers to discuss the recent AU chairperson vote. Jackie, you note that losing the recent AU chairperson vote has been a serious setback for South Africa and its foreign policy. Why do you say this?
South Africa pushed very hard on the elections, harder than I've seen South Africa push for something that it wants in a long time. And the result is quite a divided Africa Union, a sense that a number of African countries clearly did not want South Africa or any strong country, any major African pivotal state, to take up the chair of the Africa Union Commission. So the result is a bit of a divided Africa Union, which I think is the exact opposite to what South Africa wanted to achieve.
What do you believe are the main reasons for the outcome of the vote?
South Africa did not build a consensus ahead of the vote. So what happened is that it campaigned very hard for the elections, but it ran into opposition from the other pivotal states in Africa. Nigeria in particular campaigned quite hard and aggressively against South Africa. Kenya didn't support South Africa, as far as we know. Neither did Senegal, neither did Egypt, neither did Ethiopia. The only pivotal state that really voted with South Africa was Algeria. And this tells you that the other larger countries are not comfortable with having South Africa, the largest economy, a very powerful state, head the Africa Union. So that's a major concern. The other issues relate to divisions between Anglophone and Francophone countries. There's a strong feeling Ping is a Francophone candidate, that he has a second term, and him and his supporters feel that he should be allowed to finish his second term. And the third reason is that Mr. Jean Ping has been quite an effective chair of the Africa Union. And there was a sense, why disrupt the process? Why not let him finish his second term before trying to bring in a candidate from South Africa?
The voters marked clearly drawn lines between SADC countries and Francophone countries. What could this mean for the AU overall?
It's important, while these divisions between Anglophone and Francophone countries are important, one shouldn't overemphasize them. What is interesting is that SADC voted as a bloc. The 15 member countries of SADC, according to our analysis, voted with South Africa on this, and that's quite impressive. At the same time, West African countries, the ECOWAS bloc split, didn't vote consistently against South Africa. Most of them voted against South Africa. So these divisions are existing in real divisions. There is often a bit of a myth about African brotherhood and solidarity. It is no more than a myth. African politics is as competitive as politics anywhere, and countries look after their own interests. So the fact that SADC may have felt that they have been defeated, that's the way these issues happen. What we've seen is an example of robust democracy within the Africa Union, which certainly was not always the case when it was still the Organization of African Unity.
You say that Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma is essentially a victim of South Africa's foreign policy. Please explain this.
I would put it the other way around. I would say that South Africa lost despite Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma. She's an excellent candidate. If South Africa could not win with her as our candidate, it's difficult to see us winning with anybody else. She is a high-profile person. She is well respected in Africa, both in South Africa. Remember, she was previously our Minister of Foreign Affairs. And she is seen as a tough woman who knows what she wants. The challenge for South Africa, really, we've recently seen that SADC has now said they're going to put Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma up for a second term. Because remember, this is not South Africa's candidate, this is Southern Africa's candidate. And one of the reasons why Southern Africa felt that they wanted a candidate is because in the history of the OAU, the Africa Union, Southern Africa has never had the position of chairperson. But the fact that South Africa as leading country is pushing this makes other countries a little bit afraid, a little bit concerned. But she certainly, now it would appear, is going to stand again in July, again as the SADC candidate. SADC has said that we want to stay with Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma as candidate. She's a good candidate, but her problem is that she's South Africa's candidate.
What is the key lesson that South Africa can learn from this?
South Africa went into the process quite late and did not consult with with the other pivotal states on the continent, Nigeria, etc., etc. And therefore, different to under former President Mbeki, where there was really an emphasis on building consensus, on building an alliance, and not going against the rest of Africa. Under President Zuma, South Africa has taken a much more hard-nosed approach. Some say that is the right approach. South Africa is going after its interest and saying, we've got a candidate, SADC is behind us, the rest of Africa, we're going to try and convince you and to back our candidate. But of course, the rest of the continent, very evidently, the majority of African countries do not want a South African candidate. That was evident in the vote. And even when Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma withdrew from the final round of the elections and Mr. Jean Ping was the only candidate, he could only garner 32 votes, and the opposition to him, on the other hand, remained. So you had a situation where both candidates had, in a sense, a blocking vote, and neither of them was prepared to give way, and that's reflection of real divisions on the continent. And that does not augur well. It doesn't augur well for the next summit, which is in July in Malawi, when we're going to see another round of elections. SADC has already said Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma is going to be our candidate. If Mr. Ping stands again, you could have the same impasse. So I think a lot of pressure is going to be put on Mr. Ping to step back, and some type of consensus is going to be eked out between a committee of 8 African countries that the African Union has now appointed, that is supposed to come up with a solution so that we don't face this challenge again.
You mentioned that the AU still remains lacking as an organization. Please elaborate.
The African Union is the successor to the Organization of African Unity, and I think the African Union does quite well. Africa is a beleaguered continent that its fortunes are changing, and the African Union is changing with that. It is engaging with conflict prevention, conflict management very effectively, but its challenges remain with regard to engagement on other issues, economic, infrastructure, social, and so on. South Africa, in putting forward Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma, made the argument that the African Union did not take an effective position on Cote d'Ivoire, on Libya, but the reality is that the continent was divided. It wasn't easy for the African Union to take up a position because important countries were divided. And therefore, South Africa feels the African Union had a lame duck response to, for example, Libya. Mr. Jean Ping, who is the chairperson of the African Union, really struggled to hold a coalition of 54 African countries together. So this issue around the campaign is really about the provision of leadership within the African Union. But I think Mrs. Dlamini-Zuma, if she is successful, will find that it's a different issue, leading 54 countries, which is like herding cats, as being a minister in a single country in South Africa. So as an intergovernmental organization, the nature of the job is extremely difficult because you're balancing competing interests the whole time.
How has the Arab Spring impacted on the AU?
The African Union, Africa generally, was caught by surprise by the events in North Africa. We did a study last year which pointed to the fact that North Africa has got the largest democratic deficit globally. That means that the level of democracy in North Africa was much less than one would expect, given the high levels of human development indicators that we see in North Africa, higher than in any other region in the world. And the African Union has, and most African leaders have coddled dictators like Muammar Gaddafi and what we saw in Tunisia for many years without any problems. And then suddenly the youth, social media mobilized, people came to the streets, and we saw an upwelling of a resistance against the corruption, the dictatorships and the oppression that we've seen in North Africa. This was a wake-up call to the African Union. And members are realizing that ordinary Africans have a voice. And this is changing perceptions across the continent. Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, people realize that ordinary people have a vote, have a chance to change things. And this is changing the African Union, because as the number of democracies within the African Union changes and increases, the nature of the discussions debate, of the discussions at the African Union change. So you had, for example, at the last summit, the new leadership in Tunisia coming to speak, and he brings a fresh breath of accountability into the African Union. And there you sit, he's speaking to about, I think there were about 40 heads of state, and speaking to them about accountability, about democracy, about civil society, about serving the wishes of your people. And to people like Robert Mugabe and others that have been in power for many, many years and manipulated elections, this is a bit of a wake-up call. So I think generally very, very good news, and it serves to infuse democracy, respect for human rights, and good governance into the workings of all aspects of the African Union.
How has the Arab Spring affected South Africa's foreign policy?
South Africa was perceived incorrectly at the time of particular events in Libya to be supporting Gaddafi, which was an incorrect perception. South Africa has never been a supporter of Gaddafi. Maybe let me put it differently. Southern Africa is the most recently liberated region in Africa. Therefore, heads of state in Southern Africa still place great emphasis on liberation solidarity. Liberation solidarity trumps everything. It trumps democracy, it trumps everything else. Therefore, in one sense, Southern Africa still is maturing. You don't have these hang-ups, these issues in West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa. So this is a bit of a lesson for Southern Africa, where you have a number of liberation parties who still think that they govern because of their legacy. They don't govern because people have voted them into power. They have earned the right to rule us. That is not the modern world. The modern world is that you put a policy proposal to your electorate votes on it, and you earn and re-earn with every election your right to govern. And in that sense, what has happened for South Africa, where the ANC is struggling, it's living to a large degree off its liberation credentials, but that's a declining asset. Parties like the Democratic Alliance are trying to deliver and say, look at our record. And as the generations, as time pass on, young people are coming to vote. They are saying, I wasn't part of the apartheid government, or I can't remember those years. I want to know if the ANC is giving jobs, if they are, cleaning the streets and providing us with economic and other opportunities. So that sense, what's happened in North Africa is also having an impact on South Africa. It's having an impact across the continent. It brings to mind the fact that democracy is now in Africa homegrown. It's no longer an imported Western construct. Africans want democracy because it is the best system of holding people to account.
Thank you, Jackie.